Great. Thank you very much, Adrian. I'll start, because we are running a little bit late, I'll just jump into the introductions and do brief introductions, then we'll get straight into the questions, because we've got a lot of brain power up here and a lot of experience, and I'll make sure we maximise the time talking to them. So first of all, we've got Glyn Ellis here, who is the Business Development Manager of New Energy at Shell, and you've probably heard his name a few times coming out of his mouth this morning, asking plenty of good questions. Next, we've got Kirsten Rose, who is the Principal of Low Emissions Technologies at BHP. Katie is the Group Manager of Technical Services at Oz Minerals. Emily is the Energy Market Strategist at South32. And Lance, we just heard from then, the Solar Project Manager at Sun Metals, and that was a very interesting presentation. Thanks for that. So the first question that we've got for the panel, and there are questions in the sheets, but forgive us if we get a little bit distracted, because we will let the conversation flow if needed. But the first question is about reliability and cost challenges in the Australian energy market. And if you didn't know that there were reliability and cost challenges going on at the moment, I don't know what rock you've been hiding under, because we saw all of the front pages of the newspapers before. It's definitely well covered. And it is affecting a lot of businesses, not least the mining sector, and being grid-connected mines, it's a big issue for everyone here. So I'll start by throwing across to Kirsten, if you're happy, to cover off on what the strategies are that you're using, and also some potential solutions that may be coming forward.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Louis. Well, I guess one thing is, as many of you in the room are aware, miners, and I'm only new to the industry, spend a lot of time thinking about energy strategy and have done for a long time. And certainly BHP does as well. But the events of last year really brought it into sharp relief for us, certainly in South Australia. It's public knowledge that the events in South Australia compromised us financially significantly, and I think we lost most of the year's profitability to date in that episode. So that's not something that we take particularly lightly. So it certainly did. It certainly catalyzed a conversation. But it would be kind of remiss to say that it was just that sort of catalyzed us to really take another look at energy strategy in Australia. Certainly, it was price, and certainly the price has been rising significantly. But it's also the confluence of events, which is the price is rising. There have been some fairly dramatic outages, but also as we've said all day today, the costs of renewable energy are decreasing dramatically. And that, when you layer that on with the public carbon commitments that we as a business have made, that my colleague Graham Winkleman was talking about before, it's the right time, really, for us to take an integrated look. So you asked what strategies we're putting in place. We have recently launched a major study in Australia to look at electricity supply for all of our Australian assets, and I have a colleague here today who's leading that study. And that is, for the first time, looking at all of our Australian operations and the long-term, not just 2-5-year strategy, but really the roadmap for electricity supply. And that, without a doubt, will include renewable energy. So that's just one piece of our response, certainly.
Thank you. Katie, would you like to make some comments on that one as well?
Yeah, look, being a South Australian operator, we certainly felt the same challenges that BHP did. And I think it's fair to say too, we were the ones amongst many of our colleagues sitting in a position where we had an operation running with a fixed power price and a long-term contract that happened to also expire at the time that this all happened. So not only did we come off low pricing, we landed in a very interesting scenario. And, here's me, I'm a geologist by trade, and all of a sudden my technical services portfolio is now having to address energy strategy. And as a mid-tier miner with not a large portfolio to spread risk across, that was certainly something we had to think about in a really different manner. As we look to bring the Carrapateena project online, we've had to think about at what stage in a project now do we want to think about this? Is it something at a high risk at the start, or is it something that we are happy to leave until we've got a stable running operation that we then can introduce renewables in and maybe wear some higher grid pricing while we're getting started? So it's made us think about it differently, and I would say we're probably on the journey of growing our knowledge rather than being the ones with the answers just yet.
And so does that, is the strategy just around minimising energy cost, either at the start or as operations begin? Or is it also moving to understanding the interactions between energy cost and how that may affect process optimization, like it might affect the design?
Look, it's always both. We're always doing energy audits. I think all of us up here would be always doing that and trying to improve process and impact design. But Carrapateena was a horse that had already bolted in terms of doing something completely out there and different. That's not something that we're at that stage with. We are working with Cassini Resources on an exciting project in the West Musgraves, and maybe that is an opportunity for us to think a little bit differently about how we could bring renewables in, or different alternative structures with our large plant, maybe change the dynamic.
Yeah, I was just going to maybe add a perspective, maybe a slightly different perspective from Shell. And our journey in terms of understanding where the world energy model is going or progressing has been a journey that we've been on for the last 20, 30 years through our scenarios work. And it's fantastic that we have these current realities that are occurring now where we have the ability to bring in low-cost renewable energy onto systems, and that commercial framework now makes a lot of sense. From our perspective, we started recognising that the kind of increasing penetration of renewable energy was actually occurring much, much faster, and the costs were coming down much faster, even 4 or 5 years ago, than what we were anticipating in some of our scenario planning. And we were looking out to 2050, 2100. And the questions we were asking ourselves was, what was the likely penetration of renewable energy into that world energy global mix? And then where would Shell be in terms of was it still going to be a relevant company? Where would its credibility be in that space? And if some of you have read some of the Shell scenarios work, we project that, come 2050, 2070, we could possibly be in a net zero emissions world, and we'll have 60, 70, 80% of energy being provided through renewable energy. So for us, it was about positioning for what the future is going to look like over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and beginning now on that journey to understand, what technologies are going to actually be moving forward to actually bringing us there, but how as a company we can actually continue to stay relevant, be credible, and continue to be profitable, and a company that our shareholders will want to continue to invest in.
Emily, for South32, not having any operations in South Australia means that fortunately that wasn't an issue for you, but then the drought in Tasmania was sort of your reliability risk there, and of course the high prices affect everyone. Do you want to make some comments on how you're responding?
Very fortunately for us, in Tasmania particularly, we're actually quite protected through long-term PPA and low pricing. So we weren't subjected to that, and we just relied entirely on Hydro Tasmania, and they had to fix the problem. Lucky for us. But we are grid-tied in 2 of our other operations, and so of course it's always a concern for us to make sure that cost is a big concern and reliability is a big concern, security of supply. And that's not always an easy balance. Security of supply is not a guarantee in the network, and so we do have to work with the network service providers to make sure that the way that we operate on the network is not going to cause undue stress, and in some cases actually work to actively support that network. And that's how we can contribute to reliability and security of supply on the network. In terms of cost, where we are grid tied, it's important for us to try and reduce our exposure to fluctuating market prices, especially what we've seen in the East Coast over the last 7, 8, 9 months. And we do that through either embedded generation or contractual arrangements which reduce that exposure.
Thanks. So, Lance, you just covered a lot of this in your presentation, but was reliability, security of supply one of the considerations? I guess you react to reducing your consumption regularly, but as far as avoiding times where there's zero energy coming in, and does this even insulate you from that?
I think we have got a reliable supply in Queensland. I think the grid is quite strong as it is, but it is 80% coal. So there are risks in a market like that with future risks, carbon pricing. So really, it's not about reliability. It's It's about de-risking operations, basically. So when we know what the price of our electricity is, then we have certainty about what our production levels are as well. I mean, when you talk about an operation that is, you know, normally 40% of our costs are electricity, our operating costs. So it's really about de-risking operations. I think we're quite comfortable with reliability where we are currently, and given I think the way the market will develop in the future and with batteries, I think we'll always be in a good situation in that respect as well. Yeah.
Thanks. And that was a bit of a segue into the next question, which is around carbon emissions and whether renewables can be part of the answer to dealing with carbon liability of a business. Is that was something that you mentioned there? Is it more just around the cost of a potential carbon price in, or is it a more holistic view at your emissions liability?
Yeah, it's really around what is the cost? What will the cost of that be in the future? And it's an unknown. It's a risk. So by securing our electricity supply or a portion of that, and with renewables or with solar, you're paying for it up front. You know what your cost of electricity will be, but we don't know what the carbon price will be. So it's taking that risk away, taking that out of the equation. There is social responsibility as well, and if you think about in Queensland, 294,000 megawatt hours of electricity per year. In Queensland, that's about 230,000 tonnes of carbon equivalent. So that is, we have confidence that we've taken that part of the risk away.
Do you mind if I ask Lance a question? Just building on that. I was just intrigued with how you're thinking through this. The other thing that's happening now is that there is a vast number of new projects coming onto the Queensland grid and across Australia. So you have a arguably stable grid now, but there are several other renewable energy projects which have been proposed for even that end of the grid. That's going to bring with it more intermittency onto the grid and maybe more challenges on the grid. Is that something that Sun Metals has recognised and is maybe beginning to think through?
No, we haven't really been considering reliability issues in the future. But you're right. That is a potential. I do think that the Queensland grid is quite strong at the moment, and I think with the way, I guess with recent events in South Australia, I think the way that the grid will be developed, even though states can be quite ambitious with their renewable energy targets, I think that reality will prevail, and I think the grid will still it'll be designed, that maybe there is a battery solution there which means that reliability is maintained. So I think they'll be designed, it's strong now, and I believe it will remain a strong network.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to have a quick comment on the link between carbon emissions and renewables as a carbon offset. Graham talked earlier about BHP's commitments in this area, which have been substantial and continue to be. And we very much believe that we're on a trajectory, on a long journey, a decarbonization journey, but one that will see our operations significantly decarbonized in the midpoint in the century. And that's a significant effort, because as he said, we've got currently about 18 million tons of CO2e per year. So my role is a global one, so I look at our business across the world, and it's really important to us, but renewable energy is going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in our decarbonization journey, in my view. About 50% of our group emissions are from electricity. The vast majority of that is grid connected. We have some self-generation, but it's a grid story. And as we all know, the electricity sector is going to have to do more than its fair share of heavy lifting to get to the Paris, 2-degree world. And in that, certainly in our world, the lowest abatement is likely from electricity. So that's a significant piece that we're going to have to work on very quickly, I think, and certainly renewable energy and storage is a big piece of that. And how BHP. So the question for us isn't if, it's how, and it's how do we? What's our role in accelerating the transition that the grids are going through around the world, so that we don't compromise reliability and affordability, and how do we, reap the carbon benefits of that, because it's definitely something that we've committed to the public to do. So.
Katie, does carbon come in as one of the factors you consider for assessing renewables?
Oh, absolutely. We don't operate in an environment where we've got a set price at the moment internally. We certainly acknowledge that it is a key future driver and something that's pretty important. I would like to see us reach our ambitious target of having a fully autonomous electric underground operation at Carrapateena. That's what we want. That's what we're striving for. How we get there is going to take a lot of work, but that's certainly an acknowledgement around the role that diesel plays in the operations we run at large, not just what we've got connected to the grid.
So it's interesting that you're considering renewables as potentially fulfilling a role beyond just traditional electrical loads. It's great to see. We saw an image go up of a battery electric underground mining vehicle earlier on. They're definitely at the bleeding edge now, I guess, but it's great to see it coming to market. So moving on to the question of behind the meter, which Sun Metals has done versus purchasing through the grid, through either retailers or power purchase agreements. Is there a preference that you see, or costs or benefits of either? We heard about the reducing transmission costs is a great one if you don't have to transmit.
Yeah, I think all those factors play out, right? So if you've got the option to go behind the meter and you have control over your electricity supply, then you have a lot more comfort around that. You have a lot more control on pricing predictability. Grid, there's a perception that if you're grid connected, you have a little bit more security because you've got more on the grid that's able to back you up in case of other issues. But we've also seen instances where the grid can fail because of other activities down the transmission line or the distribution line, and if you have weather events and other kind of factors that can actually control supply. And in other cases, you can have the market operator issue orders to curtail electricity coming into your facilities because of other issues as well. So there are pros and cons. I think they have to be considered on their merits. Yeah.
I'll comment on that because the other key factor for us as well is behind the meter generation means we reduce our Scope 1 emissions, and it's a direct reduction, whereas when we purchase off the grid, even through a PPA, it's only affecting Scope 2s, and that's a concern for us because Scope 1s are our biggest focus at this point in time. So from a carbon reduction point of view, that's a key consideration. All the things you mentioned are in terms of behind the meter generation, control cost, absolutely, yes, there are regulatory issues. And we often think of mine sites as being out whoop whoop, where some power sites are not. And so one of our key considerations is actually, can we actually put embedded generation on our site? And for some of our sites, that's just not possible, which is sort of unfortunate as well. And the other thing also is if we have behind the meter generation and we're grid tied, it means we get some diversity of our electricity supply, so that also gives us almost an additional reliability and security of supply because we're then diversifying where we get our electricity from. One's down, the other hopefully will be available.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we're trying to recognise and understand is conceptually you can think of all these kinds of solutions, but then there's another level of detail that enables you or starts creating barriers, and some of which are things like your current contractual arrangements with your current electricity provider. And if you bring in additional power, how is that handled, and do you have the ability to bring more flexibility around that? So even though it can make a lot of sense to actually do a lot of this now, there's a level of detail in terms of obligations with respect to existing contracts, whether it's diesel or electricity, land title issues, whether you can actually build, other issues actually becoming more involved as well.
I think Glyn's looking down at the list of questions here. That was. I'll take it as a nice segue. And Emily, just they are some of them, but more broadly, what are some of the factors inhibiting? We've been hearing about all of the reasons why renewables could be suitable, the forces driving their uptake, but at the same time, we're seeing that it's not high penetration with most mining companies at the moment. So, what are some of those main inhibitors?
So, as has been the case for a long time, high cost has been a prohibitive factor, and we've seen that coming down dramatically. And I think we're going to see that continue over the next, into the future, but certainly over the next year or two. If the trend over the last 6 months is anything to go by, we should be paying 5 cents a megawatt hour by the time we get to about 2020. But other factors are contracting. So as you mentioned, where we've got existing contracts, it's not always so easy just to plonk renewables in there. It can upset current contracting arrangements, or it's just not possible within current contracting arrangements. Space and literally within the mine site, if you can do behind the meter generation, do you actually have the space and the ability to do that? What are the community concerns around that? Because obviously if you're going to put a solar farm in, and even wind farm, if you're anywhere near a community, massive land is required, and there are community considerations. One of the other things when we look at renewables is currently it's effectively subsidised through the Renewable Energy Target Scheme. And the pricing of LGCs that we get out of renewable energy is still very variable, and so it's quite hard to put that into an economic model, because unless you are contracting them forward at a set price and then you know what your price is, that can create quite a bit of flexibility or sensitivity in any kind of economic modelling around renewable energy. And the other thing is availability, and this is something that's really important. If you're going to put a solar farm in, it works really well for Sun Metals, for example, in the way that they operate, but typically for a mine site you have a pretty flat load and it's 24/7. So the solar, the subsidised portion of your generation, if you're buying off solar, might be cheap, but it's only for 8 hours of the day, and you still to cover the other 16 hours of the day. How cheap or expensive is it going to be to do that? So when you average your cost out, is it really cheaper than traditional generation, or indeed grid generation, grid cost?
Thanks. Katie, have you come across hurdles in your assessment so far?
Oh, look, I share the same sentiment. Trying to get firm pricing around a renewable project is challenging. You've got a lot of people that want to build, own and operate something for you, but they won't firm it, and you've got others that want to sell it to you but don't have the renewable piece. I mean, I think it's changing, and we're seeing more people start to think a bit differently about it. But at the moment, that seems to be a bit of a challenge for us, just to find the right people. Oz has been very clear about the fact that we think we're great miners. We don't necessarily want to be great energy people. We want to know that we can procure great pricing on energy and have a reliable and secure supply. That's really what we want. So if we can form a really strong partnership with somebody that can help us do that, then that's where we want to go. But we're on that journey.
Lance, are you able to share any tips on how you overcame some of these hurdles?
We reviewed solar as an option in 2013, just not in great detail. We had a cursory glance and had a look at prices at the time, and it didn't really, it just didn't work. So I think for us, we don't know what's going to happen to LGC prices in 4 or 5 years. We've taken a little bit of a gamble on that, but the project doesn't rely completely on LGCs. It looks not too bad. It certainly looks much better with LGCs, but when we first started looking at it, LGCs were expected to be $80 and $80 through till 2020, and in the last 6 months they have dropped quite a lot. So currently the forecast 2020 is about $40 or just above $40. But at the same time, the market electricity price has done the opposite, and so it's really we have that advantage, and we've lost a little bit on LGCs. I think if it was a really marginal project, we would have, you would really be concerned about LGCs and what's happening in 2020, beyond. For us, it wasn't marginal. It was, once we had a look at all the numbers, it was a clear decision for us. So.
Can I just add that you're totally right in terms of looking at the electricity pricing where it is at the moment. In fact, if anything, the current electricity price is whatever the opposite of a barrier is to getting a renewable energy project on board, because it's the opportunity cost. And although it's sensitive because it can move really at any time, at the moment, in terms from my point of view, if I'm putting a recommendation forward to my VPs and COO to do a project, right now it looks pretty good.
Just another observation. What I liked about your presentation was that it was able to illustrate quite effectively that you're not just now in a position where you're purchasing electricity and supplying your own facility. You're also looking at being able to trade electricity back onto the grid. And so there's another level of sophistication that is coming into how you're operating your business, and that is, it's also something that's probably open to many other businesses as well, that they may need to start considering how they want to be playing that game, and whether they want to be playing that game, or whether they want to bring in an IPP to manage that part of the process, and where that potential additional value can be extracted from having a system nearby.
An example of that for us is we've got an emergency generator sitting there that very rarely gets used. Is that of value to us? Do we want to use that or not? I mean, these are all the things we have to start to think about.
And this ties into, this is not on the list, so feel free to ignore this if no one wants to talk about it, but it ties into the shift from KPIs to considering different parts of mining companies as profit centres, and realising that the goal is really dollars in the bank, not tonnes out the door. If you can have more dollars in the bank at the expense of some tonnes out the door, then that's what everyone should be aiming for. Whether KPIs and mandates have the flexibility of that, there might be some transition to go through there.
It's been a key differentiator actually in the leadership of South32 coming out of BHP, is that from the CEO down, it's definitely been the message that there's value over volume, and that's been a real change in mindset from the traditional mining model. And it's certainly, I don't come from a mining background, I come out of trading, and that for me that was really, really powerful and really good to see. Really like that.
We certainly talk about value, totally. The centrepiece of our growth strategy at the moment is value creation, and that's not just value creation for shareholders. Of course, that's incredibly important and is one we talk about, but it's value for employees, value for communities, values for government. We try and think about all the various different spectrums of value creation, and it does change the way you think about going forwards.
It sounds like Sun Metals has been in that mindset for over a decade, because you've been doing that exact sort of tightrope walking, and it was interesting to see. I had assumed that some of the justification was about maintaining production, but if you are selling, I guess it's that same thing. If you can sell that electricity for the $10,000 a megawatt hour, why would you use it behind the fence?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And really, 98% of the time we'll consume the electricity, but there will be those occasions where we get those power price spikes. And if you're seeing $10,000 a megawatt hour in the market, then it just makes sense. We would do what we do now. We turn down production. We can turn down very quickly and just simply export. So it adds another value for the project to us.
So we'll jump forward. There's one here. We'll get some comments on. It's a bit of a crystal ball one, so we'll see who's willing to do some predictions. It's how do you see the energy mix for grid-tied mines changing over the next, say, couple of decades? Pick a time frame that you're willing to talk about. And I guess with the cost of renewables coming down so quickly, and the series of very large announcements about renewables joining the grid, is there still a place for, if it's about buying from the grid rather than behind the meter, is there likely to be a justification for mining companies to be ahead of the curve if the grid is already shifting to renewables very rapidly?
I'd say there's still a place for behind the meter renewable energy, because simply for the purpose of Scope 1 emissions. I don't think we're going to have massive amounts of renewable energy in the grid, like to the extent that you could have to reduce the scope 1 emissions from behind the meter. So the grid might get to 30%, let's say, let's pick a number, of renewable energy generation, but it's still going to have baseload gas or clean coal. So there's going to be that baseload that's going to have carbon emissions and in it, whereas you can reduce your carbon footprint even further if you have behind the meter renewable energy. And so that's going to, I think, be a key driver within the next 10 years, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. I think the future of mining is electrified, above ground and below ground. And I don't have a crystal ball to say exactly when and how that will happen. But I think materials movement will become increasingly electrified. And I think to make that possibility, the corresponding supply has to become renewable, or largely renewable, low carbon, certainly. And we'll see grids transition, I think, and I think they'll transition faster than we think. But I also think certainly in many of the markets in which we operate, it will be a combination of grid and behind the meter. I think that will be the way that it evolves. I can't say what those percentages will be, but it won't be purely one or the other. I think for many of us that are grid tied, it's been around the world, not just here in Australia. It's been a bit of a wake-up call, I think, to realize that grids are not necessarily as secure and reliable as we had thought they were for a very long time, particularly as we're in the middle of this crazy and exciting transition time. So,
and the push to decarbonise, I'm sure there's a lot of elements to it, but are you seeing a pull from investors, customers, and society more broadly to accelerate that decarbonisation?
Yes, absolutely, on all fronts. And for those of you that saw Graham's presentation, he referenced quite a lot of the work that we do, and very publicly around scenario planning, as Shell does, and around testing our portfolio for climate resilience. And much of that is not necessarily a reaction to; it's to lead in terms of our shareholders. Who are putting an extraordinary amount of pressure, I think, on all extractive industries to sort of get in this game pretty aggressively. So we are seeing that pressure. I think this morning a lot of people talked about recognizing that the people that work for our businesses want to be aligned from a values perspective. And I think increasingly that's something that we are looking at and responding to, because we recognize that to attract the kind of talent in the technology and innovation world that we're heading into, we need to be very conscious of that, and being the kind of company that talent and that workforce is going to want to not only join but stay with. And that's not an insignificant piece of the puzzle as well, in my opinion.
I think it's really interesting, having been around the renewables industry since the beginning of the renewable energy legislation, that the impetus to put renewable energy bring it online has traditionally been through cost and through subsidies. And I think we're starting to see the dial change now, that the impetus to put renewable generation into play is actually being pushed by investors. So that is where the economic move is coming from, not just from the cost base or any subsidy under that cost base.
Probably further to that, I think going back a while, this would have been a team of sustainability professionals or environmental professionals sitting around talking about this. It's moving into technical fields. It's sitting with engineering teams, commercial teams, procurement teams. That's changing, which means the business is valuing it differently.
Yes, and it's also worth noting that we are at that point where commercially it makes a lot of sense to consider these options, and that's reinforcing a lot of investor and stakeholder kind of demands, or at least requests for these kind of diversification of energy supply to be considered. The other thing that I've kind of thought about, and I'm not quite sure if it's there yet, is if the pull is also coming from your customers. So can we see a world where the steel producers and the car manufacturer in Toyota is demanding to produce a zero carbon Toyota, for example, and do they then track that all the way back through their supply chain? And if even that's a potential strategic advantage on the suppliers, that actually can get to that kind of product line fairly quickly.
It's early in the piece, but I think it's coming. Somebody was telling me yesterday about how one major car manufacturer is now requiring that in a fairly short space of time, I think about 3 to 5 years, that their main chassis are made from metals where the supply chain is green. And so that means that our industry, as mine, is going to have to shift and shift pretty quickly.
Well, and if we don't get, in a carbon-constrained world, if we don't get emissions under control and we don't get our costs to extract those resources under control, material substitution is going to become a reality. So we're going to look at other, I mean, recycling will become bigger. We'll be looking at other materials to make things from, which is going to compromise ultimately our long-term sustainability as a business. So.
One other observation. When we're just talking a little bit about how the grid may be changing, and we often talk about, you know, the big projects which are hitting the grid, and thinking about, well, how are we handling large-scale wind and renewables and batteries and solar, and how is the grid being able to maintain and stabilise and ensure that there's secure supply. There are other things which are coming forward in terms of the residential commercial uptake with PV and storage, and the rise of EVs, and how all this is going to play out in terms of load and demand management, time of use in terms of when load is actually going to come onto the grid if there's a lot of EVs out there. So there are other things which I think the next few years are going to create quite a lot of smart people trying to think about what this could be looking like.
We've already seen that happen in WA, as you probably well know, is that the uptake of PVs over the last, on a residential basis, over the last 10 years means that the state government is dropping 500 megawatts of load out of the system because we're 1,000 megawatts oversupplied even during summer peak. And I think that that's just the pathway that's just going to happen. I'm surprised the East Coast is lagging, to be honest. Once WA is ahead for once.
And the fascinating piece about that is that that's all consumer-led. You know, that's not driven by government policy or regulation or whatever. It's about you and I and consumers being able to access, you know, that rooftop PV battery system, that EV that's going to be cheap enough to actually purchase. And the uptake of that, the question on how fast that actually increases and penetrates into the energy sector is going to be quite interesting to watch.
I think we've gone past the early adopter stage, so.
Just mention of the supply chain of the green steel for the chassis reminded me, I was having a chat to Ned Harvey from RMI the other day, and he was talking about Amazon pushing that to a new boundary where it's using blockchain technology to have chain of custody throughout the supply chain. So it's not just reliant on people's public disclosure and sustainability reports. You'll have chain of custody on how green, how sustainable your products are for every element of that product. So Ned, whack your hand up, and if anyone's interested in that, go and have a chat to him. I'll get to the last question now because we've hopefully got a little bit of time for questions. I'm sure some people will sprint out for the beers, but the final question up here is around whether and so if you're a vendor selling energy, selling equipment, this is where you prick your ears up. Is the industry providing the kind of solutions that you're looking for, or are you still getting presented with solutions that don't really fit the demands of the mining industry?
I think that typically we get approached by solar providers or renewable energy providers on their own, and they're looking for us to contract with them for the offtake of a project or to put a project on one of our sites. The problem for us though is that a lot of the projects come to us and there's going to be a period of time either during the day or over the course of a week or a month where that generation is not available, and then it's up to us to fill the gap. And that's just like hard work. We're a mining company, we're not a power producer. And so really the ultimate solution for us is for a renewable energy provider, and they're the technical experts in that regard, to partner with a large IPP, potentially one who can possibly bank the project and take some risk on the project, and for them to bring a packaged solution to us. I've got a flat load mine load, you know, a mine load profile for a mine is typically, you know, like that. So really I want them to bring me a generation profile which matches that, not one which is up and down and in between and I have to fill in the gaps. Call me lazy, but you know, we run a lean team, so I'd much rather be working with one contract and one solution than having to try and put it together like a puzzle.
I think the thing is that whilst we're all very similar and we're all big flat load consumers, all of our assets are uniquely different. And in the last 12 to 18 months, I think I've had almost 200 companies through the door at Oz Minerals to talk to us about anything from various different computer systems that will manage energy through to installation opportunities, renewables, grid options, retailers, you name it. What we can't do is share the commercial terms and arrangements of what would actually maybe be of value in that discussion. So therefore, sometimes value walks out the door, sometimes it's in the door. How we can actually work it out quicker, sooner, and speak the same language, I think is something we need to focus on so that we can actually get the ideas that matter for each of our individual assets.
I think something that's worked really well for us, and maybe this is a share, and I hope that people will take this on board, is that I think there's an alternative procurement process that we can follow. So traditionally, a traditional procurement process will say, this is the solution we think that we want. Can you price it for us, please, Mr. Vendor? But I think an alternative way to approach it is to go to a number of vendors and say, this is what we need. Please draw me a picture rather than colour in the box of what you think the best solution is for me. You're the expert as a power producer. We want to have baseload power, we want to have renewables to this kind of penetration. Here's our demand load profile. You tell me what's best for me. And I think that there's a real opportunity then for subject matter experts in the power industry and subject matter experts in the mining industry to then work together for the best solution rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I feel like even in my 15 months at BHP, it's coming together a lot better. So I think the tenor and the quality of the conversations that are happening now are vastly different to even 18 months ago that the industry is bringing to us, and that is greatly appreciated. I think the industry is recognizing the complexity that we're all talking about here, and how challenging it is, and it can be, to make, to get that trilemma right, to get the affordability, the reliability, and the, environmental outcomes that we're looking for. And that recognition is clear now, which is great. But to your point, Emily, it's a journey on both sides. So we appreciate the industry educating us and bringing us along with you, because it's not core business for us, and so we're learning. And I think to steal one of my colleagues' analogies, our procurement and our supply functions are getting much, much more sophisticated very, very quickly. So in the materials movement space, to steal his story, it's less about, I want to go buy this vendor's truck that looks like this. It's much more, I want to move this from here to there. And so we're going on that journey too. And I think if, we just both need to probably get there a little bit faster.
Collaboration is going to be key, cross-industry, cross our peers. It's the only way we're going to solve this issue, I think.
And that's a good note to finish on, I think, so that we've got time for some questions. Before we get on to the questions, please join me in thanking the panel for all of that input.
Hi there, Lewis Cowper from Sunshift. Grid-tied operations. So the conversation has focused on electricity grids, and rightfully so for the panel here. I know at least one of you have an operation on a gas grid. How best can, on a gas grid, we've got things like take or pay arrangements. How best can renewables go alongside an operation on a gas grid where there are these take or pay arrangements?
Is that me?
I said at least one. I was thinking Emily, but go for it.
So we have, with our coal seam gas operations over in Queensland, where they're very much electrified operations. We draw about 5% of the Queensland's electricity grid in terms of compressing gas into the pipeline that goes off to Curtis Island that is then sold offshore. And we also have water filtration and water treatment facilities as well. We're looking to build utility PV on those sites. At the moment, the model is actually not to build those behind the meter, but actually to bring those onto the grid. But we do recognise that with our ability to, we do have the Condamine power station as well, so we do actually treat that as a bit of a peaking plant that actually responds to pricing on the grid. what we are exploring is that as a gas developer, not only in Queensland but also in Western Australia, and having access to that supply, we are in a position where we can think about offering energy contracts where we're able to bring on renewable energy systems or whatever the mix may need to look like, but also be able to manage that flexibility in terms of gas supply for backup generation. And we're very open to explore those. Can't do much about the pipeline tariff, but we can do a lot in terms of gas supply flexibility. And we also can bring across the right mix of renewable energy that is for whatever the stakeholder is actually requiring. So whether it's a mix of PV or wind or batteries or whatever the next set of technologies needs to look like. So we're very much thinking that is something that we can offer that may be a little bit more differentiating than some of our competitors.
To add to that, I think one of the key things in terms of bringing renewables on board is that if we really understand the generation load profile and the risk around unavailability, then we're able to drop down on our take or pay or drop down on the actual amount of gas that we contract for. So really it's about as a vendor, we need to understand from you exactly what the reliability looks like, exactly how many gigawatt hours we're going to get per year, so that we can manage that in terms of where we get our other electricity supply from and how much gas we need.
And of course, for us, we are an oil and gas company as well. So that adds another layer of opportunity and challenge. So, in some cases, in Western Australia, we're using our own gas in our power station in the Pilbara. And in other places, we're looking, and this isn't exactly a question, but we're looking at how do we use existing gas asset to firm renewables. So in Chile, we're a joint venture partner with a very large 517 megawatt gas-fired power station that isn't running very much during the day. So really that's playing a very significant firming role for the renewables in the Chilean grid. And so again, I came back to what's our role in this and how do we use existing asset cleverly? I think that's a really important thing for us to unpack as well.
Hi, this is Amiram from UVI. We are a renewable energy company. A question to Lance. This is really groundbreaking, I think, project. Did you face a lot of, let's say, regulatory grid connection challenges or fees for the connection that played into your project decision or development?
So we've already got a connection agreement for the refinery, an existing connection agreement. So the way it's really just a modification of that agreement. And I think of all the aspects of the project, environmental approvals, actually grid connection and grid studies, and we're still going through that process, has proved to take the most time and probably the most risk as well. So we haven't, we've been running a lot of things in parallel with this project, and we're still going through finalising the connection agreement at the moment. So it's still a risk to us, and yeah, quite of all of the aspects of the project, it certainly has been the most challenging.
Hi, it's Jeremy Moon from Resin Australia. We're a renewable energy developer as well. A note from Sun Metals. You did a very simple thing, but incredibly clever. You looked at what your energy supply is and tailored your production accordingly. You could see that you could do that. And certainly in the East Coast, Sun Metals has a bit of a rock star status in terms of your 5-minute rule submission. I wonder whether within the mining community you similarly looked at what your load profile could be and how that might match better with renewable energy.
From a mining point of view, we have looked at this concept, and certainly it's something that's an ongoing conversation from an energy usage and optimisation of energy usage point of view. Typically, though, mine loads are flat, and there's not a huge amount of scope for movement and to be able to curtail, when pricing's high and so on. I think that opportunity is much more available in a processing or refining environment, or that sort of place where you do have some controls over what you can switch off for a period of time or what you can curtail. for a period of time. And it's a much more applicable environment. Mining, not quite as applicable. Is that your experience?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'd agree. I think something for us at the moment, it's no secret that the Prominent Hill open pit is coming to a close in the next couple of years. And as soon as the stockpiles from that are depleted, we move to a smaller underground operation. So that step change in our operation does present an opportunity to think maybe a bit differently. But that's not governed by the fact that we wouldn't like to have a flat load. It's just that we'll have a bigger plant than maybe the amount of material we're producing. So I think to Louis' point earlier, maybe that's an area for some R&D and innovation into the future around optimising plants differently or running components differently. Maybe throw that out to the community to help us solve that one.
Well, thank you again for the panel, and thanks for the questions. And also a big thank you to Adrian and the Energy and Mines team, because today has been sensational, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Thank you so much.